So I work for Museum of London Archaeology, which is a commercially developer-driven archaeological organisation. Mark's given us a bit of a setup for the Battersea Channel project, and I'm going to really give the perspective of a geoarchaeological practitioner working on it. Museum of London is only one of a number of big organisations kind of collaborating on this. So just a really quick recap on it. Nine Elms area of southwest London, lots of developments happening. My 20 new development projects is out of date, clearly, from what Mark said, referencing 50. But many of these developments have been attracted by iconic buildings like the Battersea Power Station and new developments like the new US Embassy and the Northern Line that Mark was talking about. What did we know before we kind of started this? I know Mark already referenced this a little bit, but basically the Battersea Channel became known to the wider archaeological community in London with a 2009 article by Mike Morley, and we're calling it the Battersea Channel for kind of simplicity's sake, but it is really an oversimplification. It's actually a big relic late glacial valley exploited by smaller kind of Holocene hydrology. The drift geology gave us that kind of idea of where it really lies, and basically it's splitting round, the Thames kind of split around what modern day Battersea Park and formed this eye. One of the other interesting things about the area is that up around here, around near the mouth of the Battersea Channel, is a driftfield hollow, which is kind of common in the London landscape, and it's suspected that these features were actually the reason why a lot of the tributary valleys, the major tributary valleys in London, actually formed. So we'll come back to that a bit later. There are a number of we've got like the Battersea Eye in this area, and there are a number of gravel islands important to London's history. We've had prehistoric remains found frequently in East London on gravel islands, Roman remains on gravel islands in Southwark. Westminster Abbey was founded on a gravel island on Thorney Island. But Battersea Channel's a little bit different because a lot of these gravel islands are formed in delta-like networks from spring-fed river systems. And Battersea Channel isn't really an independent spring-fed river system. It really is a secondary channel of the Thames, so it's a bit different from that respect. But apart from that, we've got the archaeology, which was interested in the area. We've got medieval timbers, Bronze Age artefacts, Anglo-Saxon fish traps, but these are all predominantly found on the foreshore, and we didn't really have very extensive archaeological record for the kind of landward part of this area. So the opportunity that was presented to us, this amount of development gave us a significant chance to investigate this kind of unique archaeological and geomorphological kind of landscape. Because of the number of the practitioners and the different curatorial offices involved, as Mark said, Historic England set up the Battersea Channel project, and the aim was for us to share knowledge, unpublished and unreported information as we were going forward, so that we could more effectively investigate and kind of protect the rapidly threatened heritage resource in this area. Now, how did MOLA as an organisation kind of do these type of things before the Battersea Channel project? Well, MOLA's portion of the kind of data set that we're looking at formed part of the MOLA deposit database for London, and we've got about 600 deposit. We had about 600 deposit records in the area we're looking at now. But across London, the MOLA deposit database kind of includes about 13,000 deposit records, and they're all kind of gathered from different commercial initiatives like the Lee Valley Mapping Project, the 2012 Olympic Development, and the Lower Thames Crossrail Project, and other kind of smaller work. But what type of data are we kind of talking about in this database? Predominantly, it's British Geological Survey data, and this is great because there's lots of it. It's free, The downside is that it's not taken for archaeological purposes, it's not taken for geoarch purposes, and the information on Holocene sediments can be quite vague and not really fit for purpose. This improves slightly if it's geoarchaeologically monitored geotechnical work, but of course the best types of data we've got in the database are the geoarchaeological purposive boreholes or geoarch descriptions of archaeological sections. But of course these are more expensive and they form a smaller part of the database. But as projects like this move forward, these are the types of data that grow, the good types, hopefully. And how do we use this data? Across London and the kind of southern England, a lot of the big commercial firms deal with data in quite similar ways. A lot of us store the kind of borehole logs and the archaeological section logs digitally in programs like Rockworks. We then use those type of systems to create deposit models to define lithology and a separate interpretive stratigraphy, and to change these into transects to then try and pull in the broader kind of geoarchaeological toolbox, paleoenvironmental proxies, biochemical analysis, dating, and actually archaeological record. And this helps to refine our models. We then go on and export the data into spatial systems like ArcGIS and use some of the toolboxes in there to interpolate digital elevation models. Based on these point data, we can then kind of work out surfaces. And primarily in commercial archaeology, the main surface we really focus on is this surface of Pleistocene deposits. This really forms the kind of early Holocene topography that your Holocene deposits have developed on. We do occasionally model like key deposits like peats, thickness of peats and things like that, to try and really focus on where our resources might be for reconstruction. The inferences are then made based on like kind of landscape zones that we see on these surfaces to really kind of work out archaeological potential for sites and to then kind of really refine our final interpretations. The entire kind of molar deposit database provides this kind of platform for data synthesis, archaeological prospection, and interpretation across London. So how did our original deposit models kind of look for the Battersea Channel project area? Well, to me, it looks really basic now, but the kind of early surfaces really gave us the idea, combining these with like transects and other forms of deposit modelling, gave us an idea that a lot of our sites were either lying on the edge of some of the ayats, like Battersea ayat, or within the deeper kind of channel areas around here. It also began to highlight this secondary ayat that was kind of splitting the Battersea Channel Valley into two spurs, and we named that the Nine Elms ayat. So how do we use this to inform strategies? In low-lying areas, we had quite deep sequences of peats and clays. There's less potential for archaeology in these kind of channel areas, and actually digging down to these kind of depths on busy construction sites is normally logistically problematic and expensive. So we generally target these for boreholes so that we've got some samples for geoarchaeological analysis later on. The higher drier kind of gravel islets and islands can really be focuses for prehistoric or later archaeology, so they're targeted for trenches and watching briefs. And this is a really standard approach for urban commercial kind of archaeology and geoarchaeology. And how did these models how did our models and strategies change as we kind of moved into the Battersea Channel project? Well, basically, with the different organisations coming together and actually sharing our raw data, we more than doubled the size of the data set. Mola went personally from 1,600 to about 1,300 data points with everyone else's data, and it really improved the detail around basically the gravel islands and the terrace edges, and we got more information on small promontories, small inlets, and the differences between really deep channel areas and slightly shallower channel areas. And this helped us target areas where we had sparse or inconclusive data, and really helped if you had a question raised on one organisation site, another organisation site could actually answer it quite rapidly. Examples of these, at the beginning, our different data, the different organisations really suggested different, slightly different landscapes. Mola's kind of northern data set really showed this this split in the Battersea channel, in the Battersea Eye, giving us the Nine Elms Eye, whereas Wessex's southern data really didn't highlight this, and they didn't think this existed. So we knew when basically looking at these sediments, the organic silts and other deposits infilling the channel areas. They were kind of radiocarbon dated to the Windermere interstadial on top of some of the ayates, and then we had late glacial, late Mesolithic dates infilling some of the lower channel areas. The sequence then filled up with more prehistoric sediments and Thames-dominated estuarine muds from a kind of more historic date. But as we then found, as we got these dates coming in, and we got a little bit more detail on the deposit model, it really became apparent that even though these sediments up here, the valley was a lot lower here, this area was slightly higher, but it was still a good 2 meters lower than the ayates on either side. And we know that there's from the transects and the dating, we know that there was episodic infilling of the valley that occurred in the late glacial and in the late Mesolithic. But we still don't really know whether this was a wetland fed by the Thames, or whether there was a channel flowing through here into the Thames. And because we've got prehistoric archaeology on both the Nine Elms Eye and the Battersea Eye, actually understanding what this bit looked like really has implications for the accessibility between these two sites. So we really do want to find out what's going on there. So we're targeting it for more sequences with more OSL dates and more radiocarbon dates to really find out when and how this filled in. Another example, this eastern route of the Battersea Channel Valley, we really had difficulty getting well-preserved sequences there. So when one of the Northern Line new stations for the underground went in, we knew that despite really difficult conditions it was a large area where they were in bulk removing all of the sediment, that we had to really, it was going to be our only chance to get these sequences, so we had to really try in quite horrible circumstances to try and get some sequences, and we even picked up some later historic archaeology doing that. Third example is we got some prehistoric archaeology first on the Nine Elms Eye and then on the edge of the Battersea Eye, and they really informed each other as to what kind of age and type of archaeology we were expecting. On the Nine Elms Eye, we were getting wooden stakes, possible fish traps. We were getting a burning campfire kind of areas with brown bear bone and some fire-cracked flint and pottery. On the Battersea Eye, we were getting Mesolithic flint tools and more substantial Bronze and Iron Age cut features and wooden structures that, because we're all sharing the data so rapidly, they've informed us that basically some of these cut features, some of these alignments of stakes are actually moving from the edge of the Battersea Eye into the deep channel areas where we wouldn't normally expect archaeology to be at those deep, those lower elevations. And so the new projects we're moving into in a couple of weeks, we're really changing our strategies from normal to actually try and pick these up and focus on these. And we're even arranging cross-organisational site visits for the site staff, so they can really understand what's happening in this area and with the project as a whole. What issues did we face? And we've kind of covered some of the good points, but over the last decade, all of Mola's geoarchaeological work has gone into the Mola deposit database. And it's a great resource for us, but as a commercial asset, it's really restricted to Mola personnel. But this view is kind of changing within Mola slowly, and the Lee Valley Mapping Project, Crossrail Lower Thames data are being shared with the Archaeological Data Service and Historic England. And we're hoping the BCP will kind of further this idea of sharing this data. The big challenge of the BCP was creation of systems capable of generating outputs to actually aid productive synthesis and debate between the partners. This, of course, complicated by the fact that we're working on different sites that are separately funded and actually at different points of the archaeological planning process. The BCP Forum provides us to some extent and has been really, really great and useful, but we don't really have a centralised dynamic resource to share this data on at the moment, and as a result it's a bit slower and more difficult than it could be. We're hoping to kind of move forward with using ArcGIS Online and the new HER that's being set up to actually share this data, but it's probably not going to be realised until the kind of later end point of the project. So data collection is coming to an end. What have we learned and how are we hoping to kind of take this forward? So basic deposit modelling is relatively cost effective. It's got, especially in southern England and London, it's got clear planning benefits to clients and practitioners. But the BCP is kind of showing that if these deposit models are actually integrated with the wider archaeological knowledge base, then practitioners and curators they're better informed and about the potential of the resource, and this really helps to address research priorities. It's hoped that this work will actually show that landscape reconstruction has a greater potential to convey archaeological findings under broad research and engagement themes. As a commercial archaeologist, it's quite important to us to recognise that even though our money comes from developers and our clients, the real reason we're doing it is public interest. That's what's kind of pushing clients to pay for this and for it to be involved in planning commissions. So in contrast to the kind of excitement of interesting archaeological finds, it really puts the onus on commercial geoarchaeology to show what impact our work truly can have. Engaging the wider public and even some archaeologists with geoarchaeology can be difficult, but it can benefit projects too. Major infrastructure projects cover large areas and different types of archaeology and periods of archaeology, quite disparate periods at points. And it can be difficult in single publications to actually pull this archaeology together into a kind of coherent story. And again, landscape can be the narrative backbone in which this is done. On the BCP, this can kind of be illustrated how archaeology developed in tandem with the landscape and how that relationship lends itself to a narrative for the area. In really simple terms, the glacial drift-filled hollow may have encouraged the Battersea Channel Valley to actually form. These islands and channel resources were apparently attractive to prehistoric and historic groups with Mesolithic, Bronze Age and Anglo-Saxon activity all appearing. This continued into the late medieval with windmills and timber yards. Eventually the low-lying channels and wetlands were exploited for watermills and industrial docks. The industry that the docks brought in lent itself to the later gasworks, railway sidings and the Battersea power station being built in the 50s. And this is all directly informed from the paleo landscape that isn't really visible to the local community that live there now. We can also use new technology to convey landscape narratives in better ways. The Museum of London's Street Museum app that used digital geo-referenced photographs really kind of caught the public attention. And it just showed that actually the data sets we've got, if we present them in a good way, can actually be quite engaging. This type of integration is becoming easier with landscape-based systems such as Esri's story maps. And I'd advise you all to check out Esri's story map website and just look at some of the examples on there. These are web-based digital maps that are populated with text, images, animation and videos to convey exciting and interactive narratives, educational narratives. Final thoughts. Specifically on the BCP, we hope to answer some of the questions concerning the development of the IATs. When did they form and when were they infilled? and of course how these landscape changes relate to human activity and settlement and movement across the landscape. More broadly in commercial geoarchaeology and deposit modelling, we're hoping to looking towards an increasingly integrated and dynamic resource, with landscape reconstruction as the framework for archaeological planning and dissemination. In the recent past, commercially advantageous resources are either hoarded by single organisations, or they just cease to be accessible after the financial limits of a project, and that isn't really good enough anymore. BCP has already shown that collaboration and coordination of a centralised resource is immediately beneficial, and we're hoping that the long-term benefits of such approach will be further illustrated as we move into the analysis and dissemination phase over the last year. So thank you for your attention.